What's up, party people? Let's get into this legal personhood stuff or legal personality. Essentially, there's you, me, your neighbor and stuff like that. We're all individuals, right? A singular entity that cannot be broken down into, or subdivided into a smaller entity. This is me, right? Whatever, in like simple terms, if you will, right? So that's the individual. And that individual can then basically take on a whole bunch of legal personalities, right? So, and the reason that is because in the old days, obviously one individual, and then there'd be like 2 or 3 people. Now you have 3 or 4 or 10 or 50 or 2,000 or 100,000 individuals all living in close proximity together. Obviously, once that happens, you get a spontaneous sort of creation of bureaucracy where we have this silly idea that we need other people to basically manage our affairs, if you will. Mostly because a lot of people are lazy and they don't want to deal with their own stuff, right? But that's another video altogether. So these bureaucracies pop up, and of course, once human beings get onto a relatively good idea, it is good in certain instances. Obviously it's turned to nefarious purposes because people love to take advantage of other people. It's just a fact, right? So obviously they found ways to now twist this bureaucracy, if you will, into a mechanism of control. And it's just basically been sort of pushed further in that direction ever since it started in the Roman times, when they really started to cement the idea of a citizen, which was a legal status that had rights and privileges when you were basically in any Roman territory, if you will, but it also came with duties and responsibilities and obligations. Right, and that was 2,000 years ago, and we've just kept going, except instead of just having one status now, the citizen, and the ability to suspend that status, which is where we're going to get into the human rights stuff. I should say this: in the old days, they used to be able to suspend your status, or your legal status, if you will, as a citizen. And when that happened, basically, you were up the creek, right? So you were not much better, or probably a slave. So obviously that's where human rights starts to factor into the equation. Is this like the obvious antithesis to this wrong here, this obvious moral and ethical wrong is that human rights were birthed, and we're like, well, you can't do that anymore. You can't create a limited legal status, right? And then force a person to take recognition as that limited legal status, and then all of a sudden say, well, we're going to throw you in jail because you didn't do X, Y, Z. That's really the long and short of the whole argument, if you will, is forcing a person to take recognition. Now, listen, they don't have to tell you anything. They don't have to help you. They don't have to explain the system or the process or anything else. So I think a lot of people get that wrong. As far as the court is concerned, they're like, you're a grown person, figure it out. And that's true, but there it is, right? So there's you and me, and we've congregated, we've created society, the bureaucracy's been birthed, and now all of a sudden there's rules and regulations, and now we've advanced all the way to modern days where we've taken the idea of citizenship and we've multiplied it by 1,000. So when you get in the car, you're now the driver. You're not Joe Blow. You're just the driver. Everybody is. You're a driver with this number on your driver's license. That's who you are. That's your real identity when you're in the car, because now you're driving under legal personhood, the driver, who's bound to all the rules of the Highway Safety Act. Right? Here's one here. Look at this definition here from the Landlord Tenant Board and the Residential Tenancies Act. Okay, this statement here comes from the actual enactment, where it says a person can be an individual here, or it can be a body corporate or a corporate body. Okay, so of course that body corporate ends up being the landlord and the tenant. And if I whip down here to section 48, which is the thing that I went through, you can see that it's the tenant that's subject to this rule. And the landlord down here in section 48 5B has to be an individual. So what they're really saying is the individual, the natural person, the human being, has to enter into recognition as a landlord in order to enact this legal process under section 48. Okay? And that legal process applies to the tenant, which means that you have another individual who needs to be recognized as the tenant for the governing body, if you will, the landlord-tenant board, to make a proclamation and be like, this person can evict you from your residence. And there it is. That's the big reveal, right? So the solution to that is basically in the 70s, of course, and in the 80s, when human rights were really starting to get big. It started obviously with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it started to build up steam and stuff like that. In 69, you have the Vienna Treaty when they're starting to formalize the language with respect to formulating these type of document, an international treaty where hundreds of countries would sign on and essentially agree to abide by these rules. And of course, by 76, they had rewritten the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into the international covenants, both on civil and political rights, on economic, social, and cultural rights. And then there's also the Declaration on the Rights and Responsibilities of Individuals to take into consideration. That's an important one. That comes directly from the preamble of those international covenants. So the thing here is once they did that, a bunch of countries like Canada, the United States, and Australia, and a bunch of places in Europe, obviously like almost 200 of them signed on, and now are legally bound to respect these rules. And the thing is these human rights, which were previously unavailable basically before 76 to be sort of exercised in a court of law, were non-existent. They were known. Like, we understood these legal concepts, but there was no mechanism, if you will, to actually invoke the right in a court of law and have a court be like, yeah, okay, sure. And that changed when the covenants came in. And you see that in the Liberty video where the United States makes a declaration being like, we abide by it. But the rights themselves are not self-executing, which means, again, you have to do this legwork by claiming the right and starting to lay the groundwork so that you can exercise these rights in the proper legal status. And that's where this gets down to. Most people, the citizen, the driver, and all that, those are limited legal statuses, meaning you've been reduced, okay, from your ultimate status, the natural person who has the full legal capacity, down to another one, which is basically controlled by the statute. So certain decisions are outside your scope of control. And this gets into the basic legal concept here of status, standing, and capacity, right? So obviously capacity is your ability to make decisions and understand conditions and contracts and terms and all the rest of the consequences, right? So if you have brain damage or whatever it is and somebody's talking to you and you're like drooling on yourself, obviously you can't consent to any kind of contract like that, so it would have no force of law. But if you're like, oh yeah, no, I do want to buy this car and it's $900 a month and all the rest of that stuff, and you sign on the dotted line and you fall behind on your payments, and then all of a sudden they repo your car and you go to court and you try to get it back, they're going to laugh in your face, obviously, because you signed on to the terms and agreement, and they're like, you're an intelligent person, you knew what you were getting into. Okay, so that's capacity. Then you have status, which is, again, that's where you're getting into these full legal capacity. That's the ultimate, the gold standard, right? The natural person basically exercising human rights. And when the government comes and knocks on your door and says, do this, you're just like, no. And that's that. And if they want to go to court, fine, go to court, but then you're also getting paid. Not only did you say no and you won't have to do it, but after a little sort of like 6-month tussle, if you will, with the government, you'll be able to easily get paid a very large and tidy sum of money where you can take yourself a little bit of a month-long vacation somewhere nice and warm and tickle your toes in the warm waters of the Jamaica or whatever it is, right? So it's all good. So this legal status and all the rest of that stuff and control over it is the mechanism by which government uses to force contributions like taxes and everything else like that. And that's where human rights really factors in. If you look at Article 1 here from the International Covenants, which has been signed on to by almost everybody, so we're just going to concentrate on this one. You see that you have the right to self-determination. If I whip down here to 4.2, you see that you have the right not to be held in any form of servitude or slavery. That's one, but we're going to talk about servitude. Go look up that word in Merriam-Webster's dictionary and see what that says. Servitude. That might be an important one. Right. And then, of course, moving down again here, you have the right to liberty. Right. That means you can basically do as you please without regard for what someone else wants. So your neighbor's like, I'm really upset right now that you're sunbathing on your front lawn and reading a book because reasons that are ridiculous. And you're just like, that's nice. That's liberty right there. Okay. And you can do that to the government too. And then of course, the last one is recognition as a person before the law, which goes a lot deeper than you think. That recognition is tied to, of course, servitude 4.2 and the right to self-determination, which is Article 1. And the point being here is that they can't force you, they can't compel you to either take recognition or use your legal personality to, officially affect the recognition, right? So they can't force you into the recognition. They can't be like, okay, you're now down here, right? If you challenge it, obviously I'm saying in a perfect world, they're like, okay, we want you to pay $5,000 because you didn't give us any money when you built this deck on the back of your house and we didn't get our building permit money and whatever else it is. So now it's $5,000 and you're like, nah, I don't want to give you the money. Right. So you send them a letter. You're like, I don't want to be this legal person, the resident or whoever it is that they're talking about, because they're going to send you a letter and be like, pursuant to this piece of legislation here, the Municipal Construction Permits Act under section 4.7, you were supposed to get a permit and all the rest of that stuff. And you're going to go to that enactment and be like, this person here you're talking about, you're forcing me into recognition, which is then there's an expectation that a contribution will be made on my behalf. And I don't have to do that because I have the right to just remain in my full legal capacity as a natural person and not take recognition because you're perturbed that I did something on my own property. There's no injured party here. You see what I'm saying? If the deck collapses and ruins your house, basically you're responsible for it. Right? If whatever your crazy kooky addition doesn't work out and burns down the whole house and you're homeless, that's your problem. And if it burns down somebody else's house, then you're going to have serious issues because they're going to sue you and you're going to find yourself even further up the creek. Right? So with great power comes great responsibility. You have to sort of be realistic about it. And we have these rules in place for obvious reasons to make sure that the idiots basically understand that there's a whole bunch of steps for building an addition onto your house. But at the same time, if you're an engineer or an architect or a very handy person or something like that, then all of a sudden you're starting to question the silliness of this because it's silly. And this is the instance where you can be like, I don't want to do that. Or more importantly is like your daughter got cancer and you got wiped out financially by, covering all the cancer costs. And then all of a sudden the IRS shows up and they're like, oh, we want $5,000 because this tax return you filed 4 years ago, we reevaluated it and, whatever, we found this minuscule mistake and now it's compounded. And you're like, I don't have $4,000. And they're like, we're going to throw you in jail. And that's when you got to be like, oh, legal personhood. Am I required to be the person that's under the control of the IRS? Or can I stay over here as the person that's in control of my own life? There's always a choice. These people have control over the legal person. They don't have control over you because we abolished slavery. We abolished servitude. So they can't do that. So they had to come up with a sneaky, creative way. And that's where the bureaucracy came in. When they register you for birth, they basically grab and sort of assert a certain kind of weird control over your property, which is the legal personality. And then they just fail in their duty to educate you about human rights, which you can read about in the Declaration of the Rights and Responsibilities of the Individual. And you can also read it in the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. It's in there too about how the government's supposed to teach you all about your human rights and stuff like that. Notice how they don't. Notice a great many things, like they create a system that's so complicated that you need like effectively a priest class like they did in the old times with religion that could read Latin to interpret this crazy chaotic system they have called the courts and law, right? They've effectively terrorized people mentally to be like, you never want to go to court and all the rest of that stuff, especially without a lawyer and all the rest. It's absolutely insane. Even though that's ridiculous. Going to court with a lawyer in most instances can be a death sentence. So be forewarned. Know what you're getting into. Buyer beware. Again, another Roman maxim. But the big takeaway, of course, is that the language that they use is completely different. It's called legalese. Understand in English does not mean understand in a law context. Person in English is not the same as person in a law context. In a law context, person can mean a whole bunch of different things. Legal personalities, right? The individual, some sort of body corporate. Again, we already looked at that from the landlord tenant board and stuff like that, and the Residential Tenancies Act. You can see it right here. The person is what, 5 or 6 entries, and then of course you have the landlord and the tenant being the body corporate, and the individual is just on its own. And you can see that the landlord is not an individual because this rule down here says that the landlord has to be an individual for you to be able to apply for this legal action, if you will. So you see how sneaky it is? And if I show you this one here, 4.3, I believe it is, it's where it points directly to the Human Rights Code. And in the Human Rights Code, under Section 3 here, you have this right to contract. A right does not produce an obligation. It produces a choice, which means you can choose to contract with these people or not. So in my case, when the landlord's like, we want to move into your apartment, they sent me a letter and this document, and they're like, we want to start using this legal process. And I just sent the letter right back to them that says, your offer to contract is rejected. You do not have to play the tenant. And again, the contract that they were trying to foist upon me came from this operation of law here, Section 48. And again, you can see it's operational upon the landlord and the tenant, not the individual. Okay? The tenant is a person, and that person can be an individual or a body corporate, meaning the tenant can either be applied to an individual, or the tenant can just be its own sort of body corporate that just sits there empty, waiting for somebody to actually take on its duties, obligations, responsibilities. Oh, I want to do something. The landlord did something to me, and I want to apply using this legislation for some sort of remedy from the courts. Well, there it is. You'd be applying under the tenant status. And then look, let's just end it here with this legal document. You see, look, I'm going to type in my name here. Look at the top here, first of all, where it says tenant. And it says it on all these documents. These are all applications. And look, when I type my name in here, look, I'll just type it in all lowercase letters. And then look what happens when I move to the next section. It puts it all in uppercase, the same ones that you would see on the birth certificate. So let's just sum up here. When you're born, your parents sign a statutory declaration, and the doctor creates some paperwork. and that effectively registers you with the state, and that's a right granted to the state under the International Covenants on Civil Political Rights right here. Once that happens, your legal personality is born. And then there's another process where the government basically seizes control. We're going to look at that in the next video. But essentially, they seize control without your knowledge or your permission, and they start operating this legal trust, this body corporate on your behalf. And instead of educating you about your human rights and being like, you don't have to be recognized as this limited legal status in law, you can remain as a natural person in your full legal status, right? The individual. They basically start making you think that now you have all these responsibilities, and that's exactly where taxes comes into it. The person responsible for taxes is the resident, not Canadians. Look at this court judgment from 1948, I think it is, maybe 46, I can't remember. It says residents are responsible for paying taxes, not Canadians. This is back when there were no human rights. So this is explaining the statutory status in plain English. The resident, the person controlled by statute, here it is. This is the Tax Act. Here's the resident. That person is responsible for paying taxes. The Canadian that is forced into recognition as the resident doesn't actually owe a duty to the state. So when you invoke your human rights after you've done all the legwork to file a declaration of understanding and a claim of right, and you've drafted up some letters and stuff like that to give notice to the individuals that are basically infringing before you file an application or something like that, or a constitutional challenge under Section 24, right? Once you do all of that stuff, then you can start this process, and you can either tell them to stop and they'll stop, and that's the end of it. Okay, well, you don't owe us $4,000. And you can take it to the extreme. Check out remission here from the Financial Instruments Act. Not only can you get all your tax money back, but it also can be used to stop any tax action against you. That's a nice little one there again. This gets back to the International Covenants, Section 47 there. See? And of course, Section 1.2. There's the operations of law and the covenant that says you don't have to pay taxes, and they're not allowed to ask you or throw you in jail or do anything else if you don't want to pay taxes. Okay? You're allowed to take and keep all of your money and spend it whichever way you see fit. And then all of a sudden you see now this operation in Canadian law that says, oh, well, we have this special thing called remission where you can get all your tax money back. Well, isn't that weird? We have a 2,000, 3,000 page tax act. So how exactly are you making the claim that, taxes are mandatory and all the rest of this stuff? Here's what the covenant says. Taxes are definitely not mandatory. It says right there in 1.2. No obligation. And then all of a sudden you have 2,000 pages of tax law, and then tucked away way over here in another enactment that nobody's ever going to know about, you have this tiny little clause in the middle of the enactment that says remission, a title that, again, almost no one would even know what that means. They'd be thinking, what, is this like for cancer or something like that, or something else? You know, the opposite of admission? Who knows? But no, it means basically you can write a letter to the minister and invoke your human rights and get all of your tax money back, all of it, all of your income tax money back, all of your property tax money back, all the sales tax they've collected from you. You could probably even threaten to go to court and be like, I want monies in addition to this because it's lost earning potential and savings potential there. Who knows? You might have invested that money and it might have done very well for you. And if you had the extra money, you've been able to buy certain things that might have been, considered luxurious at the time, but now are essentially worth a lot of money. Definitely a very plausible legal argument, but it all gets sort of it all flows from this idea of legal personhood. So you have liberty, right? Essentially, the human being existed on the land, just surviving. That's very the foundational sort of principle that governs our entire society's life, liberty, security of the person. Done. Right? And then all of a sudden, as we started to get more sophisticated with societies, and we've had a couple goes at it. So essentially you had the Egyptians, and then the Romans perfected what the Egyptians started. And then the Europeans basically perfected the Roman stuff. And then we started to export that, of course, to everywhere else in the world. And you have democracies. And then essentially, of course, the powers that be realized that you could use this for control rather than the benefit of society. Instead of making laws for the good governance, now they just make laws because it will financially ingratiate them and give them power and authority. And that's exactly what they did. And that's why you have 60 million laws, because nobody put their foot down and said, I don't want to listen and follow any more of your nanny rules, right? I just want to be left alone to do my own thing. And so that's why it's important for you to understand and be aware of legal personhood. And we'll talk about defending it, and we'll talk about basically how to claim it as property and all the rest of that stuff. But the first step is just being aware that it's there. And when you're born, it's created. And when you die, it basically extinguishes. It's not something you can give away. It's not something that you can, distance yourself from. It is a part of you, like your skin. It's the third set of skin, if you will, or whatever set it is, exists in the purely sort of imaginative world of the law, of words and ideas and morals and ethics. It's not real. So this is the way that you interact with that system that's integral to the state, because it's the very thing that will protect you from the state when the state is like, okay, well, we want to start overstepping our boundaries of authority. And you see that the Second Amendment is probably the most classic example. You're supposed to just be able to own a gun, walk around with a gun, and do what you will. But look at how many rules and regulations there are with respect to it. And the reason that happened is because people just gave away that authority to the bureaucracy. They're just like, manage the situation for me. And then, of course, they capitalized on evil situations where dysfunctional and psychotic people basically engaged in very questionable behavior and did horrible things. And they grandstanded on it, and they used that emotional moment to push the goalposts a little bit further in the other direction. And now all of a sudden we have this massive uphill battle. But the truth of the matter is it's not impossible. So just keep that in mind. Legal personhood exists, and it is the very mechanism by which the government uses to control you in society, what we call the free democratic society. Okay? That's how they do it. They don't have power over you, of course not, because that would get into a situation where it's slavery and all the rest. And of course, if you're talking about criminal law, it's completely different. I'm talking about victimless crimes here. You built a deck, you're just doing what you want to do, and you're not hurting anybody, and it's just somebody sticking their nose into your business and being a busybody. Or showing up with their hand out and being like, give us money for no real apparent reason. And you're like, no, I don't want to give you $5,000 for this worthless permit for me to make my own place better because I need to, because the garage is falling down. You know what I mean? Like, no, I can barely put the garage up as is. I'm not going to give you another $5,000. This is how you can basically stop that stuff, is by understanding that legal personality exists. You can claim it. It's your property. And then later on, you can then fill in some basic documents, and you can now start to notice these people that are infringing on your right and forcing you into recognition as a limited status legal person. Okay. And then saying, oh, well, now you owe a duty and an obligation and responsibility to do all this stuff like the tenant and the landlord have to do. which is not true. Of course, you can do a whole lot of other things. There's many other ways to approach a legal problem. It doesn't always have to be dealt with just with this, the hammer and nail situation. You can be more eloquent about it and maybe more efficient and probably smarter. You know how it is, but that's how it is. They're just basically shoehorning you into this situation because it's convenient for them and they have all the power. But as soon as you shirk off that yoke, then all of a sudden you're the one that's striding high and you have a new level of confidence about you. And now you can handle your business when something serious pops up, like the government's like, come calling. Like it happened to me. If I didn't know that stuff, I would have lost and I would have been thrown out onto the street during a housing crisis and there would be nowhere else for me to go. So I was do or die. And I ended up winning, and now I'm filing a very, very juicy lawsuit against these people, and I'll show you all about it. But if you don't understand how to access and utilize this skill, you can find yourself in a very serious situation. And there's stuff coming up like future pandemics, or being drafted into the military, or having your property appropriated through eminent domain or something like that, or just the government doing some other naughty stuff, or the schools basically interfering with the education of your kid, or with the sort of moral upbringing, if you will, with respect to your religious persuasion. There are so many ways you can use human rights to basically correct the societal ills without actually having to worry about waiting for government to do anything, because they're never going to do anything. They thrive on chaos. They thrive on the madness. They thrive on dysfunctionality because nobody knows what head of what chicken to cut off to basically deal with the problem. The way to do that is just to sit down and create a Zen bubble around you. And then when people start to invade your personal space, you can basically give them the old kung fu move in a court of law, if you will. And that's all it takes. And trust me, it'll only take one or two punches to the nose for the government to start to understand that you're not a person that they're going to be able to push around. And then they'll just leave you alone permanently. Freedom. See you in the next one.